Ann Wagner and Sarah Beth Broderfinger to turn your videos on, just so we can see that you're here.
They are all on.
Sarah Beth. And hi, Ann. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. Alexis, would you like to just display the slide that goes with this panel, and then we'll invite you to introduce yourselves, just so you have a heads up. Okay, so welcome back for our second session, and thank you to the speakers for the first session. If you are still on, that was a great session. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the speakers at this next session. What we've decided to do is to take a case example of an I statement, which has been screening for autism spectrum disorder in young children. It was last reviewed and given a statement by the task force in 2016. And we're very lucky to have representatives from the task force, from the funder, and from the researcher perspectives with us today. So let me look to our speakers to introduce themselves, starting with Mike Silverstein.
Thanks, Tracy. Mike Silverstein, I'm the director of the Division of General Pediatrics at Boston Medical Center and Boston University, and a member of the task force. Joined the task force a couple months after the autism recommendation was published, so it wasn't in the room where it happened, so to speak. But very interested in the topic and happy to speak to general task force methodology.
Terrific. Let me look to Ann Wagner.
Good afternoon. I'm Ann Wagner. I'm in the Office of the Director at NIMH, and I also hold an appointment from the Secretary of the Department of HHS as the National Autism Coordinator. So I coordinate autism-related activities across the federal government, including research, and also help coordinate research activities across the NIH, with autism in particular specialty.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us. And Sarah Beth Broderfinger.
Hi, I'm Sarah Beth Broderfinger. I'm a pediatrician and a health services and implementation science researcher, also at Boston University and Boston Medical Center.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I understand from our National Academies organizers that you have brought what's in your brain and your presentations, and you're going to have a discussion, but starting with Mike. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having us. And we kind of felt when we met yesterday that kind of sparking a discussion might be more interesting than serial PowerPoints. So that's what we're going with. And I've been asked to reflect a bit on sort of like unpacking the I statement for autism screening. So in 2016, the task force issued an I statement, unable to assess the balance of the risks and benefits for early screening for autism spectrum disorder. And I understand that in a previous meeting, you had a general discussion about sort of reasons for I statements. So I won't get into that, but really just reflect on this case example. I think kind of 80% of the rationale behind this I statement really kind of revolved around the applicability of the treatment evidence to a screen detected population. And that is a fairly common theme across a number of topics, and to some degree quite a subjective assessment. And on first blush, sort of the first pass conversation on that would obviously be sort of severity of illness. Kids who have to be detected by screening may have a less severe form of what we all know to be a heterogeneous condition than kids who come to attention in other ways. And if the treatment evidence focuses on a clinical population, can you extrapolate it to kids who are presumed to be less severe? And I think that conversation is is good and it's valid, but I also think it sort of misses some of the big picture too around, I guess I would call kind of in the general category of sort of family-based treatment seeking behavior. If someone is screen positive for autism based on a universally conducted screen, moved on to sort of a diagnostic evaluation, there's lots of issues around kind of follow-up to referral, the cultural relevance of such a diagnosis, whether that diagnosis is sort of within the family's kind of lexicon of possibilities, what they were expecting. And every time, we sort of talk about, and this isn't my area, but the treatment cascade around, say, HIV care, you have to, seek treatment, you have to get the medications, you have to take the medications, you have to adhere over time, all this kind of stuff. There's a cascade around that for developmental conditions in kids as well. And through that entire kind of link around identifying kids at risk, confirming the diagnosis, having the services for autism not being delivered on site in the pediatrics clinic, having lots of variability community to community and state by state around the availability and intensity of such services. I think the extrapolation of treatment studies from clinical populations, largely kind of run through specialty developmental behavioral pediatrics venues, to a screen detected population across communities, across states, across socioeconomic groups, across cultural groups, across racial groups, was really a challenge to make that connection. And so that is, I think, probably the single biggest factor behind the I statement there. I think there's other issues as well that kind of jumped out to me as I reviewed the recommendation statement from now 5 years ago, and it really revolves around kind of what outcomes are measured in the treatment studies as well, and for this, language outcomes, interaction outcomes, and cognitive outcomes were kind of the main ones that were assessed in the studies. And I think we have to sort of take a step back and ask ourselves kind of almost a common sense question around, well, do we think early detection of autism is going to change cognitive outcomes in studies with months-long follow-up periods, not years-long follow-up periods? And in the absence of kind of more granular measures of family-based quality of life that we can deploy in a population like this, are we really going to move those sort of core symptoms of autism type recommendations with early screening? And I think it's just a question to put on the table and to sort of ask ourselves, are some of the treatment studies at least relevant to screening, kind of barking up the right tree relative to outcomes? And the last comment, two comments I'd make is, one, that autism is such a heterogeneous condition, and you're kind of left with kind of pick your poison in a lot of ways. Treatment studies that try to kind of hone in on a specific subpopulation within the autism spectrum versus tend to be broader based and kind of look broadly at kids across the spectrum, and then trying to extrapolate which subpopulations would be most applicable to a screen detected population. I think that's a tension. And then the last tension, which doesn't fall directly within the task force purview, but I think is relevant to at least kind of perceptions of how I statements are received, which is, as autism screening becomes more and more ubiquitous, lots of reasons to screen for autism other than a letter grade or an insufficient statement from the task force. As autism screening becomes more accepted and more ubiquitous within general peds and family practice contexts, what are the opportunities to do the real study, the direct evidence study of screening versus not, when the number of venues across the country that don't screen gets smaller and smaller over time? And even more appropriate, perhaps, is that are they representative of the clinics that do screen? That what does it say in this day and age if a certain pediatric practice is not screening for autism? Does it mean that they are located in a community that has really difficult to access services? So why screen for something you can't do much about, given your local community context? So probably as time passes, more and more difficult to do that direct evidence study. So that's my sort of, from the standpoint of a task force member, how I see or how I unpack the I statement. And I'll hand the next series of comments on to Anne.
Okay, thank you so much for that overview, Mike. It doesn't make us that optimistic listening to you. So I'm hoping that Anne will solve this issue for us.
So Anne is going to focus mostly on how we responded, how NIH responded to the task force recommendation, and have some other thoughts at the end. But so I was asked to address a couple of things, and I will weave those things into my presentation. One of them was, to what extent did the task force recommendation influence NIH's research focus? And what I would say is that it reoriented our focus. So NIH had an active grant portfolio of research on autism screening, but the focus at the time was really on decreasing the age of detection, increasing access, decreasing disparities, etc. And those were not the questions or the gaps that were raised by the recommendation. There are a couple of cooperative bodies that pre-existed the task force review, and I want to mention those because they were really critical for our being able to respond. In 2014, before the task force recommendations, one of the program officers at NIMH, Danny Pintello, coordinated NIMH researchers who were doing autism screening research into a network, which was called the ASD Peds Network. And they developed some common measures. They met monthly to share experiences, etc. So this was an already pre-existing body with expertise among the researchers in screening, and that was incredibly helpful to us. And then another committee is the NIH Autism Coordinating Committee. So since 1997, officials from 5 NIH institutes that have substantial portfolios of autism research have been meeting at least monthly. Each of those ICs have their own specific programs, but we all collaborate on large initiatives like the Autism Centers of Excellence. So we already had relationships and we're talking frequently, and that was helpful. So in August 2015, when the draft recommendations were published and made available for public comment, discussions started among the ASD Peds Network as well as in the NIH Autism Coordinating Committee. We also wanted to get broader input and also telegraph more broadly our interest in addressing the recommendations. So NIMH coordinates the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which is a federal advisory committee made up of representatives from across the federal government, as well as community and public members, including autistic individuals, parents or caregivers of autistic people, care providers, and researchers. So in January of 2016, we had a meeting, and Michael Grossman from the task force attended, as well as some community pediatricians and researchers. These IACC meetings are open to the public, and they're widely attended virtually by the autism community and researchers. So that was another way to both telegraph our interest in addressing the recommendations and receiving broader input. So the point is, I guess, is that the discussion started soon after the draft recommendations were posted on whether and how to reorient our research activities. So another question you asked were, how directive or non-directive did you try to be? So did we rely on investigator-initiated proposals? What determined the award mechanisms we used? In this case, the research field was highly invested in addressing the recommendations. We didn't have to generate interest in doing that. But there were a lot of discussions about what was feasible and ethical, and we didn't have all the answers. So it was somewhat of a collaborative process of trying to figure out how to respond, I would say. When the final recommendation was published in February of 2016, that gave the NIH program staff the specifics they needed to conduct a grant portfolio analysis. So everybody collaborated on an in-depth review of what was currently funded, what projects were underway. Would they have results that would inform those research gaps? And one of the things that was determined through this portfolio analysis, for instance, was that within the ASD PEDS network that I mentioned before, collectively, they would be screening more than 70,000 toddlers in community programs. But because those projects were initiated prior to the task force report, they weren't directly addressing the task force recommendations. But this was an opportunity potentially to leverage some of our current initiatives. So that was one thing that we tried to do. We always try to leverage existing activities and investments when we can. And so we took a close look at what we could do in that regard. One of the investments we had already committed to was recompeting the Autism Centers of Excellence program. This is a large program that makes multiple awards, and it's recompeted every 5 years. It covers a broad range of topics. And we were actually working on finalizing the RFA for the recompetition at about the time that the task force recommendation was posted. And so in July 2016, the RFA was published. And at that point, the field was already thinking about the recommendations so that there were proposals that were intended to address those recommendations that came in. Reviewers were also aware of the importance of this, so that was helpful in terms of the review. And from that, one large RO1 was awarded in September 2017 to Diana Robbins. This is a study that addresses gaps identified by the task force, and it's using a randomized design. It's comparing the outcomes of children with ASD detected by standardized early screening to those screened at a later age. So it's not screen versus no screen, but it's the timing of the screening. This project is ongoing, and it's expected to be completed in 2022 or 2023-ish. The other the other way that we tried to leverage existing initiatives was to post a notice requesting supplements to ongoing grants that could address the gaps recommended by the task force. So in October 2017, we initiated a notice requesting proposals for supplements. 5 NIMH awards were made and 1 NICHD award was made. These are shorter term projects, which is one of the reasons to do supplements, of course. Some of them have ended, 2 are ongoing, and publications are really just starting to come out from those supplements at this point. And then finally, as a result of the discussions, we did receive an investigator-initiated RO1 proposal that was funded in March 2020. And this is a longitudinal examination of long-term outcomes from a large cohort of children who were detected very early by universal screening at well baby checks, and comparing them to children who did not participate in early detection program. So in this case, the outcomes will be assessed at 6 to 10 years of age. There'll be over 600 children evaluated. So this is not a randomized controlled trial. It's not randomized, but it's a closely matched cohort study, and there's a replication built into the design. So this study started in March 2020 and is scheduled to end in March 2023. So that's an overview of what we did. A couple of things I just want to highlight, sort of some of this people have already talked about, but developing special funding initiatives takes time. So the process can take up to 7 or 8 years from the point at which you get a commitment for funding from your leadership to the awards are made, the project is done, and publications come out. There are some challenges for neurodevelopmental disorders that I want to highlight. One we've talked about before is just the feasibility and sometimes the ethics of the traditional RCT. So some alternative designs like the ones I mentioned, it'd be interesting to hear what people think of those alternatives. So there's great heterogeneity, and the outcomes are developmental processes that gradually deviate from typical development over time, right? Some faster, some slower, but it's a gradual deviation. So that proposes challenges for measuring outcomes. So what we're measuring, when we're measuring them, most of those measures are pretty intensive, personnel intensive. And because of the heterogeneity, we really need a large number of participants. So I didn't have all the answers. I raised some more questions, and I'm very interested in thoughts from the panel and from you all about these challenges.
And that is a terrific overview. Thank you so much for giving us the history. It helps us better understand the interactions. Last on our speaker list, we have Sarah Beth Broder-Fingert, and we're very interested in hearing your perspective as a researcher.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be able to talk. I'm hoping to give this sort of the Hamilton room where it happened perspective as one of the founding members of the ASD-PEDS network and as one of the PIs of the long-term outcome R01 that Anne mentioned. I sort of have been involved and actually a co-investigator on 2 of those supplements that Anne mentioned as well. So I've been very intimately involved with all of these initiatives as an investigator. So I think I can hopefully give a perspective from that. So just briefly, I think Anne did a really nice job describing the ASD-PEDS network. I think I'll add a few minor things that I think will be helpful for people in thinking about that perspective. So the network consists probably of about 20 investigators total. We don't have an organizational structure, so I can't say there are certain core and peripheral members, but we do meet, or until COVID, we met once a year in person, and we would meet monthly via Zoom to discuss the network and the ongoing studies. And as soon as the task force statement came out, those calls became very focused on the task force statement. And I think what's really interesting and important to note, particularly in the context of thinking about whether or not or what a taxonomy should look like, I think it took at least 6 months for the group to grasp what the task force statement even was. The initial response was very focused on this being a recommendation against autism screening. And you had, I think, some of the best autism early detection researchers in the room together discussing it. And it took a while for the group to understand that this was not a recommendation against autism screening. And I think if you look at the published literature, the commentaries that came out around the time of the task force statement, I think it reinforces that notion. I think, the titles of those commentaries were things like rigid, inflexible task force statement, baby with the bathwater task force statement. So I think there was a lot of a combination of confusion about what the task force statement was even saying, combined with some frustration from the research community that they felt like they didn't either understand or agree with the methodology that the task force had used to come to this conclusion. I think once we were able to clarify that this was a statement that recommended more research, not a statement recommending against autism screening, I think the next level of challenge for as a researcher and as a group was what are the studies that actually need to be done to answer the task force statement. And I think Mike really nicely and clearly articulated the biggest concern from the task force perspective, which is, does autism treatment work in a screen detected population? And I think it took a while for the research community to understand that that was probably the most pressing question. And again, I think just some anecdotal examples from my own experience are that a number of the studies that I've been involved in have focused on what are the harms of autism screening. And I think that a lot of investigators had the question of, if we answer the question that there are no harms or there are very minimal harms, will that actually inform the task force in a meaningful way? Because it was stated in the task force statement, it did say, you know, there's a lack of data on harms. But what was unclear, I think, to the research community was, how important is it to fill that gap? And is that, it may be true, but how much influence will it have on the task force statement if we are able to fill that gap and we find that the harms are either non-existent or very minimal? So I think once we were able to get our heads around what that statement was even actually saying, I think it was a challenge to figure out what were really the studies that needed to be done to move the task force. And then I think the other things that came up were, I would say, we'll just echo what has already been said by Mike and Anne, which is that designing some of these studies was really, really challenging, and thinking about how to design these studies. For one, if probably 50 to 60% of clinics are already screening for autism, how do you design a randomized trial where it's already happening in the community? And I think that was a big challenge for us as we were trying to think about doing studies that would fill the gap. I think when you, exactly as Mike said, when you layer on top of that the sort of time course of outcomes, if you don't expect to see improvement over a short period of time, but you expect to potentially see improvement in outcomes over a longer period of time, again, how do you design a study to ensure that you can follow children for a long enough period of time? And I think that's where we tried to fill that gap in our R01, which said that we had already had ongoing studies, and this was sort of a follow-up of those kids longer term to see if we could try to answer that question. And then I think the other questions that Mike brought up around what are the outcomes that we actually want to look at? Is it just IQ and verbal ability? What about family outcomes? If families really want to know if their child has autism, that's a short-term outcome that we could answer pretty quickly. But we didn't quite have those standardized to the level that we felt like we could study it yet. We didn't quite know what those outcomes were that were the important sort of family level outcomes. So those are some things. And then I guess the last thing I would just bring up is that, you know, I think that the majority of pediatricians screen for autism probably because the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends it. And I would say there were a lot of people clinically who felt like this was either an answered question or not necessarily a question that they were invested in answering, because the American Academy of Pediatrics was already telling them to do it and they were doing it. So I think from the perspective of a researcher who might want to engage clinics as study sites, there was not a lot of excitement to become a study site for something that they felt like was already either an answered question or not a worthwhile question. So those are sort of that's my overview of my personal experience doing this work. But I think I'll leave it at that because we were really hoping to have some time for a conversation or questions.
So thank you, Mike and Sarah Beth, for a set of really terrific, really perspectives on what you experienced related to the I statement on early childhood screening for autism. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question, and then I see Venkat has his hand up, and we'll look to the other members of the committee. So my question is actually for Sarah Beth. It was very interesting to hear you say that it took a while for the researchers to understand what could address the task force's needs in this situation. Can you tell us a little bit about how you learned that and what could have accelerated that process of, task forces thinking these are the priorities, researchers did not really understand what was going on. What would have been helpful there?
So I think the what ended up being helpful was that we actually asked Mike to come to one of our meetings to explain the task force's perspective. And I think that was the thing that sort of ultimately got people to really understand what was the primary question that was being asked, or the most important questions that would be useful in answering the task force statement, or moving the statement to an I. I think what might have been useful is if there was some way to connect with researchers in this space at the time that the statement comes out, for them to better understand what the key concerns were. I think they're written in the statement. They're there. It's not like they're not there, but there's also a lot in there. So I think, and then the last thing I would just bring up, which may be unique to autism, is that, for example, in the ASD-PEDS network, I'm the only physician in the group. It's all psychologists. There's one other nurse practitioner in the group, and there may be a slightly different perspective on sort of how the healthcare system and public health that may have sort of interdigitated into the way we were thinking about this. So I do wonder if there's a difference in perspective for people who do more like health system research versus psychologists who tend to do more laboratory-based research. So those are, I think, some of the things that could have possibly created barriers. But I do think that honestly, having a human explain what the task force was really working for, and the framework that the task force uses to ask these kind of questions was very helpful.
And you had mentioned that you reformulated your portfolio, or the autism portfolio was reformulated soon after the task force statement. Was it sort of crystal clear to you what the task force needed, or a similar question, what would have accelerated that process?
So I think it was a similar process to what Sarah Beth is describing with the researchers, and in a lot of cases we were going down through that process together, the NIH staff and the researchers. So reformulated might not have been the right word. We didn't stop doing what we were already doing, but we just were trying to fill in the gaps and refocus on some areas of need. I think it's probably the kind of thing that requires multiple discussions. I do agree. I hadn't really thought about it, but I agree with what Sarah Beth said, that it would be helpful it probably would have been helpful to kind of, weight the recommendations in a way, in the report, like what's most important. Because I think people focused on things that they could feasibly do first, and those were not necessarily probably the things that would have the highest weight. So I think more discussion. I don't know if there's a way to have even some of these discussions before the research plan is developed. It might help with some of the different perspectives and just having language that speaks to everybody. I know this time around there's some of that going. I wasn't aware what was happening prior to the research plan before the last one. So these are complicated. I think it's probably multiple discussions, really, as early as possible.
Okay, great. That's very, very helpful. Let me look at Venkat, and then I'm also looking at the screen to see if other committee members.
So my questions to Mike, and possibly also to Anne, it's about the choice of outcomes. Again, by holding on to the standard that the outcome should be about the benefits of treatment, are we missing some of the other important benefits of screening, such as in the case of ADS, access to disability services or educational accommodation, either educational resources or for the gifted or the high functioning autistic children, certain accommodation in universities, etc. So I'll be missing all that by insisting that we need evidence just on treatment.
I'm happy to reflect on that, and I really appreciate that that question, because it accesses sort of a couple of really fundamental points. The task force is really beholden to looking at outcomes that reflect either length or quality of life. Those are the outcomes that we, by our methods manual, really have to base our recommendations on. At the same time, there's a subjective interpretation of what we refer to as the intermediate outcome, health outcome relationship. That there's some recommendations where that relationship is so strong, say quitting smoking, for example, even though it's not a reflection of length or quality of life, we're pretty sure that quitting smoking is good for your long-term health and you will live longer. And so I think, sort of unpacking your question, the short answer is yes, we have to sort of look more broadly and be sort of, but the task force will always ask whether those sort of process outcomes or those behavioral outcomes or those access to service outcomes convincingly speak to something that can really be impactful to length or quality of life. The second point is that the task force doesn't design the original studies and is somewhat is beholden to what the outcomes are of those original studies. And I would say if I was an autism treatment researcher not looking at the impact of screening, I might assess different outcomes from if I was a treatment researcher looking back towards screening as something that was in sort of my my point of view. So I think it's a complicated question.
Very helpful, thank you. I'm looking at the committee members quickly. I see that Sukuri, you have your hand up, so let me look to the committee and ask if there are other questions at this point from the committee. And seeing no one at the moment, let's go to Sue. Sue.
Oh, thanks. Just let me say what a stellar panel, and as well as the first panel, and clearly engaged committee. So I'm very much enjoying this. I have just a couple of, maybe there are more comments that I'd be interested in the reflection from the task force member, the funder, and the researcher. The first is, I think a taxonomy has been said, not just closing gap. So
I'm sorry,
about
Sue,
understanding what might not be feasible. And
we were missing some of your words there. Could you possibly repeat what your first sentence?
Say that again?
We were missing some of your words.
Am I breaking up?
Yeah, breaking up a little bit. So try again.
Yeah, I don't understand what's going on. In fact, my husband brought one of our internet picker-uppers outside. So I'll try this again. And my apologies, because I'm freezing every so often. I mean, literally in the backyard, but also freezing every so often. So I was going to say that a taxonomy also lets you know what might not be feasible. And my experience in talking to funders and the task force members and so forth is nobody wants to be the skunk at the garden party. Nobody wants to say we can't do this. And it's important to be able to understand that even though it would be great to have this information, it might not be practicable to do that research. So, and another reason why something might not be feasible, not just in terms of the the cost or the setting or so forth, is there's no practice gap to fill. And that's one of the criteria that the task force uses for prioritization. And in this conversation, I heard there may not be a practice gap to fill, that it's being done anyway. And if that's the case, then, you know, you can't do the study. And I guess the second point I wanted to make was the importance that's been highlighted of the communication processes outside of the taxonomy and bringing people together. You know, the task force methodology is rigorous and difficult to understand and you know, quickly. It takes task force members time to get on the learning curve. And so having a task force member explaining to the researchers what the gaps are, it was really, really valuable. And if that could be codified in some way so that the funders and the researchers and the task force get together, that could really be a helpful part of you know, building on a taxonomy. And I guess I'll just stop there. I really appreciated great talks.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So what you were observing was an area that was giving me a little bit of pause, and that is this. I think that feasibility is all relative, right? And so if I had looked at this I statement in 2016, I might have thought a randomized trial of screening, early screening versus not early screening would not have been feasible. And yet Anne has just told us that they funded one. It was not, you know, maybe not throughout the network, maybe in a particular area. So I guess that I'm struggling with the concept of whether the, if we would put feasibility as part of a taxonomy, which I actually think is a useful concept, who decides on feasibility? And if someone says something has low feasibility, are we being the skunk at the party and calling off the effort too soon, in a sense? It's a little bit of a philosophical question, and maybe I would look to Mike if you'd like to respond to that, because I know you wrote a very thoughtful editorial at the time of the initial statement. You weren't on the task force at the time, but you were trying to point out to the research community what was needed. If we had a taxonomy at the time, and you know, the feasibility was one of the elements in it, what would you have said, or how could you have framed that?
I think it's a really good question, and it sort of speaks to what should be in the task force's purview and what shouldn't be, and what differentiates the task force and from other organizations. And I guess that in the spirit of answering a question with a question, what was going through my mind, Tracy, when you were saying that was, is the task force any more or less equipped than any other organization to assess the feasibility question? We have, our strength is in our methods, and our methods reflect a critical review of the evidence. We often have what we call contextual questions that answer issues that may be sort of like circulating around the main question. And maybe you could argue that some of those questions should address feasibility, but I sort of wonder out loud whether we as a group of 16 are more equipped than funders or professional societies to understand you know, the feasibility question. The second sort of response to that is there's more than one way to skin a cat, and I would say most of our recommendations, or at least a lot of our recommendations that are not I statements, are not answered with the direct evidence pathway, meaning that there is no trial of screening versus not, that it's a pieced together links of the chain. The screening tests are okay, there's minimal harms, and now let's look to the harms and benefits of the treatment evidence, and then ask this applicability question at the end. And so there's other ways that may be more feasible, personal opinion, than that sort of like direct evidence, grand, all-encompassing RCT.
Let me look to Anne, and if I could put you on the spot. I know that as a funder, you think a lot about this, as does Sarah Beth, but you're kind of upstream as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mike said, and I don't know the answer to whether that's, assessing feasibility is the task force's job. I mean, I think that feasibility is not yes or no, right? It's sort of some are more or less. And as Mike Lauer demonstrated, some really big things are feasible if you have a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of resources to put into them. The trial that I mentioned that is randomized, it was made feasible in part because we happen to have this Autism Centers of Excellence FOA on the street, which gives a lot of resources to a project. So it wouldn't have been feasible to come in through an investigator-initiated R01. So there was something else. But I also interested in what Mike said is that it's not always the direct evidence that resolves some of the task force recommendations. And my question to answer a question is there a way, are those shared? Like, is there a way for people to see what has worked in the past that might not be the traditional RCT, or what kinds of measures have been used to resolve evidence gaps in neurodevelopmental conditions that might have some of the similar challenges to ASD. If there's a way to share past experiences, I think that would help researchers. It would help move things along. You wouldn't have to spend 6 months maybe trying to figure out how to even start to approach something.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think something that committee can take under consideration as we do our work. Let me give Sarah Beth the chance to say something, and Sue, I see you have your hand up again, so we'll go to you before we close the session.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Anne said about, if the large randomized controlled trial seems out of reach, not feasible for the research community. I think our conversations were very focused on, well, what weight do some of these smaller studies actually hold, and are they worth doing? So if we could, as Mike said, looking at the effectiveness of treatment in a screened population, is that study worth doing? Is it really going to move the eye, or is it going to be a small piece of evidence, but because the true large randomized controlled trial wasn't done, in the end, it's not going to be considered that weighty in the final statement. So I think for the research community, the feasibility question is more, I think it would be more helpful to better understand the weight of sort of each step in the chain of the framework, to understand, do I want to try to tackle a single link in the framework because that would actually hold weight and have potential to move the eye, or I don't want to do that because in truth, yeah, maybe we could do that, but it's not really going to move the eye. So that's not really the thing I want to go after.
Great. Thank you. Let's go back to Sue, and then I'll, as the last thing, I'll look to the committee members for any last comments before we close. Sue.
Thanks, Tracy. I just want to make one comment about the taxonomy. I don't think it's just for the task force to use. I could envision bringing together funders, researchers, and task force, and everybody has their go at the taxonomy. And they may or may not agree, but it gives a common language and a coming together point for having those kinds of conversations around feasibility, around study design, around common outcomes, whatever the elements of the taxonomy are. So Tracy, I actually think it's incredibly important to have these kinds of dimensions available for discussion. And I would think about the taxonomy as a coming together point, not as simply, a should to the task force to do. So that was all I wanted to say.
Great, thank you, Sue. And Bob, I see that you have your hand up as well.
Thanks for all of this. I'm basically a physician gerontologist, so I'd actually looked at one point at autism in older people to see what happens. But I'm not a psychologist and nor a pediatrician. I'm interested in sort of a general question for the task force, particularly Dr. Silverstein, but others as well. Is it possible, did you look at the script when you present a screening tool to a patient? Do you warn them that if this turns positive, that you have the following gauntlet may occur? And I'm just curious as to, I know this sounds like an IRB question, but I don't mean it to be one. The question is, do you warn patients, in this case parents, what will happen if it's positive? What will we recommend in general? And I'm thinking of another example because it was pointed out earlier that that the new lung cancer screening question, was just published, and somebody's already complained that well, you may have to have thoracic surgery if we want to warn you about that. So I'm just wondering about are the parents prepared for the outcomes as they would for any screening test of any kind?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think it's a good question because to me it sort of speaks to this whole issue of like, well, what happens after a positive screen? That question is another way to sort of access this applicability question we brought up, at the beginning of the discussion about applying the treatment evidence to the screen detected population. After a positive autism screen, there's no automatic diagnosis of autism. There's a referral to a diagnosing specialist. The family has to attend that appointment. Sometimes in some centers, that's 3 different appointments. In some centers, it's 1 appointment. In some cultures, it's easy to explain what a positive screen means. In others, it's really difficult. Some families come to a pediatrician's office prepared to be screened for things like this, and some don't. So I think your question to me really accesses the, and maybe this is a good way to close the session, the root of the I statement, which is, well, what happens after a positive screen? And in answering that question, can you access this applicability question?
Wow, wonderful observations. So I just want to thank our panelists for this panel, Mike and Sarah Beth. It's really a privilege to get insight into the interactions of a trio of people like yourselves, and you've taught the committee a lot. So thank you so much for bringing your perspectives to us.
Thank you
For having us.
Yeah, and so I see that we're at our last session, and I am going to switch gears now and ask Ned and Alan to turn their cameras on. So, and get back to gallery view. I see Ned, I see Alan there. So, so thank you both very much for joining us. We've invited you, Ned, as a former task force member. You were chair, I believe, correct? Yeah, for quite some time. And then, and Alan as the, a former NIH director and also with AAAS. I'm going to give you a minute to introduce yourselves, and then we've invited you because you have big perspectives and you're big thinkers, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about the work that lies before our committee. So Ned.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I'm Ned